Let's get started. You want to open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 21. We'll spend a couple of minutes there, and then we'll move on to chapter 22, which will be the primary focus of our lesson this morning. But let's open with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word, and we ask that you guide us this morning as we study it. We thank you for the example of Abraham and his faith. And we pray that you will help us to obey your voice as he did, to take action based on our faith as he did. And we just pray that you'll help us to apply these things to our life. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen. All right. So let's pick up in chapter 21 with Isaac's birth. So if you recall from last week, we looked at in chapter 18, Abraham has already been promised that he is going to have a son through Hagar in chapter 17. And in chapter 18, the Lord visits through these three men. It appears to be two angels and the Lord appearing in some capacity, who come and tell Abraham again, and Sarah, who sees and hears these things, that she is going to have a son of her own in about a year. And so when we come to chapter 21, verse 1 reads, "Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised." I think it's easy for us to kind of forget Sarah when we get so focused on Abraham, and I think that's fair. But I think it's easy for us to kind of push Sarah to the side and think of her as less faithful than Abraham because of the things we read about her. You know, it's her that suggests him having a child through Hagar. She laughs in chapter 18 and is when she's told about having a son of her own, and some take that as a kind of a lack of faith. But we need to keep in mind that Sarah is a key part of God's promises as well. And we read about her faith as well in Hebrews chapter 11. You may want to put your finger there because we're going to come back to it again today. But in Hebrews 11, verse 11, it says, "By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised." So Sarah is faithful as well, and trusting in these promises as well. As we read in chapter 21, Abraham is 100 years old when Isaac is born. So if he's 100 in chapter 21, how many years has it been since chapter 12, where we first read God speaking to Abraham and giving these promises? How many years have passed? 25? Yeah, he's 75 years old in chapter 12. So it's been 25 years. So this has been a long time coming for Abraham, and there's been a kind of a winding road getting us to here. But we read about Isaac being circumcised on the 8th day. That shows Abraham's faithfulness to that covenant in chapter 17, and their celebration. And in verse 6, Sarah says, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." You can just imagine Sarah around other people. Like this would have been just kind of something you have to laugh about. I mean, Sarah having a child at this age, and Abraham having a child at this age. It's beyond belief. It's miraculous. And Isaac's name, in fact, means he laughs, or one who laughs. But then as we go on through chapter 21, the celebration kind of fades away, and it's overshadowed by conflict. Remember, there's this other son that's still in the picture at this point, Ishmael, the son of Hagar and Abraham. So as we continue going in chapter 21, Sarah sees Ishmael mocking Isaac. It's not entirely certain what the age difference was. We're not certain how big a deal this was. We don't know the full context of what was happening, but whatever was happening, Sarah was clearly upset by that. So she goes to Abraham and essentially demands that Abraham send them away so that Ishmael is not going to interfere with the promises to Isaac and with his inheritance. And so, understandably, Abraham is distressed by this. If you recall back when after Ishmael has been born and God is promising to Abraham that he's going to have another son, and this son is going to be the one of promise through whom all these promises are going to be fulfilled. Abraham's like, well, if only you would accept Isaac, if only Isaac could live before you. So Abraham still cares for Ishmael. It's not that Ishmael is just this son that he wants to shuffle away. So in chapter 21, when Sarah comes to him and asks him to do this, he's distraught. He's distressed, understandably so. And so God reassures Abraham and tells him, no, you do what Sarah is asking for you to do, because Isaac is the promised son. He is the one through whom I'm going to fulfill these things. But what we see, though, is that, again, Ishmael is not just going to be cast out, forgotten, cursed as a result of all this. He too is going to be blessed. God had came to Hagar back in chapter 16 and made promises to her about her son and how he will become a great nation as well. So Hagar and Ishmael go, and we don't have time to go through all of that story, but as we see, God cares for them in the wilderness, and Ishmael is going to go on to have many descendants as well, just as Isaac does. But we really want to focus our study this morning on chapter 22, which is fair to say is kind of the pinnacle moment in Abraham's life. And I think as often, if we think of why is Abraham this faithful man, I think we would normally come to this story, and rightfully so. So in chapter 22, in verse 1, it says, "Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you.'" So, we skipped over some other stories as well that, are not unimportant, but we don't really have time to dig into. But some things have happened in Abraham's life. But at the end of chapter 21, we learn that Abraham is living in Beersheba in the land of the Philistines, and he's been residing there for many days. And we don't know how much time passes from chapter 21 to chapter 22, but it's been quite some time. Isaac is growing up. He seems to still be probably a boy of some age. We don't know exactly how old. But Abraham has been living in the land of the Philistines for many days. And I'm mindful as I read this chapter in the beginning of the discussion we had when we talked about Noah. If you recall, after the flood, after all those big things that happen, Noah gets to a point where we think he kind of can rest. He's able to plant a vineyard, to live a life of relaxation. And what do we read? He gets drunk, and there's sin that follows from all that. Here, Abraham has been patient. He's been faithful. He's been waiting all these years for the birth of Isaac, and now it has finally happened. And can you just imagine what life was like for Abraham and Sarah as they're enjoying this son who they have just eagerly waited for their entire marriage? He's finally here. Can you imagine the joy they felt and how much they were just enjoying life in these days where they're living in Beersheba? And it would have been easy for them to, as we talk about with Noah, they've been faithful, they've done the things God asked them to do, and now God has blessed them. It would be easy for them to get complacent, to kind of let their guard down. And we talked about how when life is like that, when life is good, when we've been faithful for a time, it can be easy to let our guard down, and I think that's when the devil often wants to tempt us. But interestingly here, it's not the devil who is seeking to tempt Abraham. Instead, it is God who has come to test Abraham. We're told specifically that God tested Abraham. And so I think that the devil tempts us in order to bring out the worst in us, but God is here testing Abraham in order to bring out the best in him. So we're told that God tested Abraham. God is going to put him to the test to reveal whether Abraham is truly faithful, and in doing so, he's going to bring about stronger faith in Abraham. And again, remember, I think we mentioned this earlier in our class, James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4. Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And I think when we think of that verse and think of this idea of enduring faith, I think we often think about enduring through sin, enduring through temptation, enduring through suffering. But a part of endurance is enduring the tests that God puts before us. And if we think about what made Abraham this great man of faith, it was that his faith was tested. It was proven by God, especially here in chapter 22. I think about, the idea of love, how love is strengthened and proven by testing in the same way. If you think about a newlywed couple, they certainly love each other, but there's a difference between that love and the love of a couple who's been married for 50 years, right? They've been through the sickness and health. They've been through the better or worse. That's a love that's been tested, it's been proven, and it's been strengthened. And faith is strengthened and proven in the same way, and we see that here with Abraham. So if we think about this test, take now your son, your only son. Now, obviously, it sounds weird for God to say your only son, but I think the idea here is your only son, the son of promise, Isaac. Ishmael has gone away to do his own thing, and so now he is left with Isaac, the son of promise, your son whom you love. It's almost like the more God says this, he's trying to, impress as he goes along on Abraham how big a deal this is going to be. Your son, your only son, whom you love, go and offer him. So what do you think is going through Abraham's mind as he's hearing this and as he's preparing to do this? Yeah, I think ultimately we're going to go to Hebrews that talks about that. I think that's probably ultimately his conclusion. But I'm not sure that was like his immediate reaction to this. What other things do you think he was thinking at different points during it? Yeah, he's waited 25 years since God promised him, but I think Abraham and Sarah were waiting a lot longer than that, wanting to just have children in general, right? So they've waited their whole adult life to have a son like Isaac, and now you want me to kill him? I don't think so. Exactly. Yeah, it's like, what do you want from me, God? I mean, I thought the testing was over. I mean, I've been faithful all these years. Now, I mean, what's going on here? Yeah. That I'm going to come to that in a minute. How matter of factly this plays out. There's so many things that I'd want to know. Like, how does that? Did he tell her what he was going to do? Did he keep it from her? But if he tells her, yeah, can you imagine that conversation? I mean, as anxious as Abraham was for the birth of Isaac, think about Sarah. I mean, I love my kids, but mom has a different relationship with their babies. And can you imagine the relationship Sarah had with Isaac and how much, if she's told about this, I can't imagine what her reaction would be. I don't know. We're not told. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say there's a lot that would have been going on his mind, but I feel like there had to have been what felt like a boulder just dropped on Abraham when God tells him this, and how this would have weighed on Abraham emotionally and spiritually. Keep in mind, we're told that he's being tested here. So we know what God is doing, and that God doesn't intend for Abraham to sacrifice his son, but Abraham's not told that. He's not told this is a test. If you're in school, there's a difference in how you respond when you hear over the intercom, the siren telling you to evacuate, and you're told this is a drill. There's a difference in how you react to that versus a siren where you have no idea that it's a test, right? So Abraham doesn't know that this is a test. Um, so yeah, a lot of ways he could have reacted. Are you sure? Do you really even mean to keep these promises anymore? What's going on here? But what God is doing is testing to see if he's truly faithful, and I think he wants to see, is Abraham willing to completely surrender himself to God and lay everything that he holds dear upon the altar and sacrifice it for God. This son who Abraham has been waiting for, who all of the promises rely on, he wants to see, is Abraham even willing to sacrifice him for my sake? And so then in verse 3 and the following verses, we read about Abraham's response. Abraham got up early in the morning. He prepares. He saddles his donkey, splits the wood. He travels. It's a 3-day journey. He takes some other men with him, but then when they get to the place, Isaac and Abraham walk alone. Again, I wonder what kind of conversation there was in some of all this. We know a little bit because we see some words from Isaac. Yeah. But what we see from Abraham is really the same response that we saw in chapter 12. God calls on Abraham to go to a place that I will show you. And what do we read? Abraham went and he obeyed just as God commanded him. So we see that here as well. And so again, what stands out to me as I read through these verses is just kind of how plainly and matter-of-factly this is all stated. We're not told about the emotion. We don't read about Abraham struggling with this or questioning God. But I have to think that the emotion was there if we read between the lines. That there was struggle and despair. Because if this was easy for Abraham, it wouldn't have been a test. If this didn't mean anything to him to go and sacrifice Isaac, it's not a test. And so there had to be struggle. Abraham gets up early, we read. How do you think he slept the night before this? You ever have one of those nights where you just can't sleep because something is just weighing on your mind and you realize it's 3:30, 4 o'clock, and so, well, I might as well just get up. I kind of, we don't know, but I kind of think it was maybe one of those nights. Yes, sir. Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. Uh, right. So that's the thing here is, we read it. It takes us, 30 seconds to read this passage, but this is a 3-day journey. Maybe part of 3 days. It may have been part of one day, a full day, and then part of another day. Yes, absolutely. But think about it. How do you think Abraham feels as he lays the wood on Isaac's shoulders? Or how do you think he felt as Isaac asks him, looks at him, and has been helping his dad through all this? And at some point, Isaac just can't wait anymore. Dad, I see the fire. I see the wood. Where's the sacrifice? Where's the lamb? Think of how he would have felt as he tied up his only son and placed him on the altar and grabbed the knife and began to raise it. But each step of the way, we see Abraham obeying, doing what God told him to do. And so, despite whatever struggles and concerns and worries Abraham has at all this, as you've all pointed out, we see him acting in faith and doing what God has told him to do. And despite what I think ought to have been a very uncertain moment, or several moments over a few days in Abraham's life, we see him, I think, acting with certainty, with the resolve in what he's going to do. Notice in verse 5, when Isaac and Abraham leave the other men behind, it says, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." And again, as we've already pointed out in verse 7, when Isaac uh, asks his father about where's the lamb, in verse 8 it says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And so Abraham, although he had to have been going through a lot of things in all this, we see him acting in faith, acting with certainty and obeying God. But still, I just wonder, how can he do this? How can he just be willing to sacrifice his son? Well, I think if we again go back to Hebrews chapter 11, I think we have some help in understanding why it is Abraham acts with such faith. How can a man do this? How can a man pass a test like this? Well, remember first what the Hebrew writer tells us is the definition of faith in verse 1. Faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen. So Abraham is acting with that kind of certainty of the things he hopes for. Drop down to verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And the one who had received the promises was offering up his only son. It was he whom it was said, through Isaac your descendants shall be named. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So why does Abraham act with this kind of faith? Why does he obey? It's because he had faith in God's promises. He still believed after all these years, and no matter what God told him here, that God was going to make things right. God is going to fulfill and bring about those promises. And so whether it was that God was going to stop him at some point, as he did, or whether it was that he was going to raise Isaac from the dead, Abraham knew that God was going to make things right in the end. If you look at Hebrews 11:19, that verse in the New American Standard 2020 version, it says he considered that God is able to raise people. That word that's translated there is considered is interesting if we think about the Greek word that it comes from, logizomai. It means to reckon by a calculation. And if you look at the King James Version, it uses the word accounting. So I think it's the idea that Abraham, as God is telling him to do this, he is carefully thinking about what God is telling him to do. And he's concluding reasonably, based on the evidence that he has, that God is going to make all of this right. I don't want to do this, God, but I know that you have been faithful all along the way, even when I have not been, and that I know that you are going to fulfill your promises. So that's why Abraham is able to do this. That's why he's able to be willing to do this here in chapter 22. So if we come back to Genesis 22, we read on in verses 11 through 18. Abraham is acting in faith. He's ready to strike Isaac. And of course, the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham and stops him. Imagine the sigh of relief, the weight that's lifted off of Abraham's shoulders. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, that's another one of the things, other than the question Isaac asked Abraham. I imagine there were some other questions. I imagine there were some other conversations. And it's just one of those things that, yeah, there had to be more that we don't read about, that we're not told about. Yeah. Yeah, I think Isaac, you know, you're right. He had to remember this very well, but I think he would have looked back on it as just, wow, I can't believe the faith that my dad had to do that, and clearly he would have learned that. But good observation. Um, So, verse 12, Abraham passes the test. God says, I know that you fear God since you have not withheld your son, your only son for me. And so, of course, there is a sacrifice that is provided, the ram that's caught in the thicket or the thorns that gets offered in place. And so because of that, God renews these promises in verses 15 to 18. So he says, I will greatly bless you. I will multiply your seed. Your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. I think talking about how, his descendants will be able to conquer their enemies, will be able to take this land that they're in one day. In verse 18, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. But we're told specifically, again, it's clear in the text that Abraham is not given these promises and they're not renewed just because Abraham, was a nice guy. It's because Abraham obeyed God's voice. That's why Abraham is the one through whom all these promises are going to be fulfilled. So as we think about, our kind of key things we want to take away from this very important chapter, one is just the practical lesson for us. We learn, I think, in this event as much as any other event in Abraham's life, why he was such a great man of faith and what it means for us to be faithful. I think we see that living a life of faith doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect. Abraham's not perfect, but it means obeying God's voice and fully surrendering ourselves to God and laying anything that would stand between us and Him on that altar, so to speak, and being willing to give it up. And if we think about fast forwarding to Jesus and what He says, what He asked us to do, Jesus calls on us to do the same thing. He says to take up our cross and follow Him. Mark chapter 8 and verses 35 and 36, Jesus says, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it benefit a person to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? And so we have to be willing to give everything up. Maybe it's our job, maybe it's a hobby, a habit. Certainly it would be sin. It may even be a relationship or family. Because as Abraham learned, nothing in life can be more important than God. Again, Matthew chapter 10, 37 to 39, Jesus says, the one who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And the one who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And the one who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. The one who has found his life will lose it, and the one who has lost his life on my account will find it. And the other big important thing that we, of course, want to think about before we leave chapter 22 is all of the connections to the gospel and the cross that we read about in chapter 22. There's really two ways. Yeah, go ahead.
One lesson I would like to emphasize. There are many people, right? Faith is defined by a single moment. Might get lost in the way. This faith you see that Abraham is doing life, things about that, he's a little bit everything that God has done for him, everything that God has promised him. That's and for us, as Christians, we're interacting with one another. It's important to see God see the way as the context of all things He's done for us and all things He's promised us. And that's what Abraham does here. That's why you don't think you see a lot of doubt or a lot of hesitation.
Yeah.
Abraham, he's seeing into the lens of everything that God has done for him, everything God has promised to him. Listening to God's word is a process in a way that normal person can.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think, again, we've talked about this, Hebrews 11, I know we keep going back to it, but, what I think unites all the list of names there is that Abraham and Moses and Noah, they don't live their life based on what's right in front of them. They have this eternal perspective that is guiding everything they do, this trust in what God has promised that they're going to do. Promises that they're not necessarily going to see fulfilled in their own life, but they're ultimately looking way far ahead than we tend to ourselves. So as we think about the gospel and where we see it in chapter 22, there's really two ways that chapter 22 points us to the gospel. One is that seed promise again in verse 18. And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Paul, we won't take the time to read it, but Paul really connects the dots for us between that promise and the gospel, and how all of the nations, not just the Jews, but the Gentiles, will be blessed because of this seed promise that's fulfilled through Christ. You can read about that in Galatians chapter 3. But God, again, is pointing Abraham way into the future to Jesus, his descendant, who's going to bless all of the world. But the second way in which this passage really points us to the cross is how this really just heavily foreshadows, in many ways, the things that we see happen to Jesus. So if you think about it, Abraham is to sacrifice his promised son, Isaac, just as God gave up his son, Jesus, who was promised. Isaac and Jesus are both born miraculously, right? Isaac could not be born but through a miracle. We're told Sarah was past the age of being able to do that naturally. And of course, Jesus had his birth that was miraculous. Both of these births were highly anticipated. Isaac was highly anticipated by Isaac and Sarah. And of course, Jesus is highly anticipated throughout time, all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. We think about where this takes place. It takes place in Moriah, and we can read in 2 Chronicles 3 how Moriah is the location, Mount Moriah is where the temple is built. And so there was Jewish tradition that the temple was actually built right on the spot where this happened. I don't know that that's really clear. I think here in Genesis, God seems to be referring more to a place or a region rather than a specific mountain. But this certainly would put these events in the area of Jerusalem where Jesus would be crucified. We're told about a 3-day journey in verse 4 that, God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and then it's a 3-day journey, possibly a portion of 3 days. But if you think about it, from the time that Abraham's told about this, Isaac's kind of dead in his mind until 3 days later when there's intervention and God spares Isaac. Verse 4, there's an interesting statement. I don't even know if it's intentionally foreshadowing the gospel message. But it says, on the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And I think about Abraham and how he is, had to have been in his mind really struggling to grasp why God is asking him to do this, feeling the emotion, and yet all throughout this, he is just focused on the task at hand. He sees the place where God has sent him. He raises his eyes, and he is setting his mind on what God has asked him to do. And I think about how Jesus, as he's going through his life, he's setting his mind on what God is asking him to do. But clearly, he was agonizing over what God asked him to do. You can read about that in the Garden of Gethsemane. But there's an interesting phrase that I think relates pretty heavily to what we just read about Abraham in Luke 9, verse 51. It says, when the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And if you look at the Greek there, what that literally says, where it says he was determined to go to Jerusalem, it literally means that he set his face to go to Jerusalem. So you see Abraham looking up and looking at the place. He's setting his mind on what God wants him to do, just as Jesus is setting his mind and setting his face toward Jerusalem and what God had called on him to do. Of course, Isaac carries the wood and Jesus carries the cross, as we read about in John's account. But when we get to the moment of sacrifice, that's where the two stories really diverge, because we see that Isaac is spared. There's a ram caught in the thorns that takes Isaac's place. But Jesus was the ram. Jesus was offered in our place, and so he's beaten. He has a crown of thorns. There's another connection for you, placed on his head. He carries his cross, and he's offered by God. And so Abraham learns in this moment that God provides, and that's what the place ends up being called. But this story points us to a greater moment where God ultimately provides this ultimate sacrifice through which the whole world is going to be blessed. And so we come back to Hebrews chapter 12. At the end of this hall of faith, so to speak, that we read about, chapter 12 really, the beginning of it really connects to chapter 11. And I think it kind of nicely ties together these two ideas from Genesis 22, this example of faith and what it means to be faithful, and this connection with Jesus and the cross. Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we also have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let's rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let's run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking only at Jesus, the originator and perfecter of the faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So after telling us about all these examples of faith, especially about Abraham and how he offered Isaac, it connects the dots for us in chapter 12. What did Abraham do? He rid himself of whatever was entangling him. He was willing to offer his own son if it meant getting closer to God, improving his faith. He ran that race with endurance. And what does chapter 22 also point us to? It points us to Jesus, as the Hebrew writer does here in chapter 12. All right, any questions? We've got to move on kind of quickly, but any other questions or comments about chapter 22? All right, yes. Yeah, we don't. He seems to be submissive, and again, I don't know if he's 4, if he's 24. I suspect he's kind of a young boy, but yeah, there's something to that too. Yes, sir. hmm I don't think Abraham knows exactly what was going to happen, but I do think he had faith in God to. I think however this was going to play out, he knows that God has promised him to do many wonderful things through Isaac, and so one way or another, that's still going to happen. Uh, I don't, unless I missed something somewhere else, I don't think we know how old he was. But yeah, I think he's probably not. I don't. He's clearly not an adult out on his own at this point. Um, but anyway, yeah. Well, and if you look back just for a second at chapter 21 at the beginning, uh, in verse 2 it says, "So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him." So God does things on his own timeline when he believes the time is right. And it's kind of like with Jesus, we read that he heads to Jerusalem at the appointed time when it was time for him to do that. And so that requires some faith from us and patience to wait for God to do things in his own time. All right, so let's quickly cover the next 3 chapters. I know we have to kind of skip over some stuff, but chapter 22 is really the climax of Abraham's life, and so 23 to 25 tell us about the last days of Abraham as his life comes to an end. So there's really kind of 3 important stories to mention here. In chapter 23, we read about the death of Sarah. And there's a couple of interesting things about that. Um, there's really not, if you read through Scripture, there's very few recordings of the death of a woman in the Bible. You read a lot about men who died and how old they were. If we think about the genealogies we've read, they're very focused on the men, and we understand the reasons for that. If you think about the kings, we read about the kings, but we don't read about very many of their wives. But Sarah's death is actually recorded here, and her age is even specified. And as far as I can tell, that's the only time in the Bible that we're told about a woman who died and how old she was when she died. So you may find that interesting. But in that chapter, we read that Abraham's moved again. It illustrates for us again that Abraham's not settling. He's not placing down roots. He's living as a stranger in this land of Canaan, and that will eventually be given to his descendants. And so chapter 3 really is focused on Abraham buying and negotiating for this place where Sarah is going to be buried. And that's, I think, kind of important for us, because even though Abraham's not going to really possess the land and possess this land that he purchases, but it shows faith that one day his descendants will, excuse me, possess this land. And so he and perhaps his descendants to be buried in it. So that's really chapter 23. Yes, ma'am. Really? Okay. That's very cool. That had to be a surreal experience. So chapter 24 tells us about Isaac's marriage. And this is a pretty long chapter. I meant to figure out if this was the longest chapter in Genesis. I'm not sure whether it is or not, but it's a very long chapter. But chapter 24, Abraham's very old. He's got to be at least 137, because we know Sarah died when she was 127. And we're told that the Lord has blessed Abraham in every way. And verses 2 through 8 in chapter 24 actually give us the last words of Abraham. And he is instructing his servant to go and find a wife for his son Isaac. Abraham instructs his servant to find Isaac a wife, not from the daughters of the Canaanites, but where? Sorry? Yeah, from Abraham's relatives. I think we often think of that as Abraham wanting Isaac to have a wife from his relatives because she might be faithful to God. I'm not sure that's really the reason why, because I think part of why Abraham is told to leave his homeland is to get away from what seem to be pagan relatives. But I think it's more just that Abraham knows that the land of Canaan doesn't belong forever to the Canaanites. They're eventually going to be taken out of the land. It's going to be his descendants who will inherit the land. And so Abraham does not want his son to marry who from the daughters of Canaan, who clearly are wicked, but who are not going to be the ones who keep the land going forward. Excuse me. We see also, though, that Rebecca doesn't seem to come from a very faithful family as well. She's a descendant of Abraham's brother Nahor. Her brother is Laban, who we're going to read about coming up. But as the story unfolds, Rebecca is chosen for Isaac. And then chapter 25, we're going to read about Abraham's death. Chapter 25, we read about him dying at the age of 175. But interestingly, we read about something that you may not have realized or may not have remembered, that Abraham had a second wife, and he had several other sons and possibly some other daughters. But we read about Abraham marrying Keturah, who bears several sons to him. Abraham is going to send them away with gifts in his lifetime, kind of like with Ishmael. But as Abraham dies, he's going to give all that he has to Isaac. I just want to, we don't have a lot of time left. We mentioned, it's mentioned there that Abraham his concubines. As he's giving gifts to these concubines. When it says concubines, I think it's referring to one Hagar and Keturah. Keturah, if you look at the genealogy in First Chronicles, Keturah is referred to as Abraham's concubine. Um, we're not told about any other wives or concubines that Abraham had children with. And so there's some debate over what that means. Does that just mean that they were, lesser status than Sarah? We're not sure. But I just want to mention as we end here, it's interesting to think about some of the different parts of Abraham's life that we think of as mistakes or sins in his life. He clearly is not perfect, and some have mentioned to me, that we don't really ever see Abraham punished or condemned for any of the mistakes he makes that we think about, with Hagar or what he does in Egypt. And one, I think we need to be careful about, having strong opinions about some of these events when we don't have all of the context for what's happening. And two, just because we're not told specifically about a punishment doesn't mean that there's not a punishment or a consequence. Abraham and Isaac are clearly going to see some of the consequences of things that happen. And then the last thing is, to the extent that any of these things are weaknesses or sins in Abraham's life, they clearly pale in comparison to the overall life of faith and obedience that Abraham lives. So that's going to wrap up Abraham for us. We're going to shift our attention to Isaac and really Jacob very quickly as things move on. So in order to be well prepared for next week, I want you to read chapters 26 through 30, and we'll pick up there next Sunday. Thank you for your comments.